It is my pleasure to introduce the next panel. I'm going to actually turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Professor Stephanie Zonstein, who will introduce the panelists on theoretical perspectives.
Okay, hi everybody. This is the panel on theoretical perspectives. So our first panelist is going to be Desmond Jagmohan. He's an assistant. Sorry, is this better? Okay, first panelist is Desmond Jagmohan. He's an assistant professor of political science here at UC Berkeley. He specializes in the history of American and African American political thought with a focus on the politics of the oppressed. His first book, Dark Virtues, Booker T. Washington's Tragic Realism, draws on years of archival research to recover Washington as a virtue theorist of the oppressed. Professor Jagmohan's teaching has also been recognized with the 2025 Social Science Distinguished Teaching Award here at UC Berkeley. Our second panelist is going to be Francesca Polletta. She is the Chancellor's Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Irvine. Much of her work investigates how culture sets the terms of strategic action, understood less as beliefs and worldviews than as familiar relationships, institutional routines, and conventions of self-expression. In her award-winning book, Freedom is an Endless Meeting, Democracy in American Social Movements, she showed that activists over the course of a century styled their radical democracies on relationships like friendship, religious fellowship, and tutelage, and fractured along the lines of those relationships. Her most recent book, Inventing the Ties That Bind, Imagine Relationships in Moral and Political Life, explores how Americans think about what they owe others, arguing that people's rich vernacular of solidarity offer possibilities for building a more inclusive politics. So let's welcome first Desmond here to the podium.
Thank you. So the challenge today will be keeping you awake for the next 16 minutes by discussing history. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, so I want to make a counterintuitive claim. We should return to seminal figures in American history and ask why they treated questions of character as the root of our gravest civic ailments and as the starting point for their remedy. So today, certain dispositions do not merely hinder our ability to counter polarization, they may lie at its very root. As we know, toxic polarization occurs when citizens come to see their opponents not simply as mistaken about policy, but as dangerous, moral, perhaps even evil. This outlook nurtures vices such as contempt, distrust, even hatred for those on the other side. And I want to suggest that these vices, or being in the grips of this sort of disposition, we might want to think of it as a form of moral self-harm. We might want to think every time that feeling of contempt rises, say, for the MAGA voter, not just the other side for us, that might be revealing something about how lost we are. So I want to think about here perhaps the inner injuries of toxic polarization. So once these dispositions take hold of our character, compromise becomes unbearable and consensus unimaginable, making a shared public life nearly impossible. American politics has known periods when citizens cast one another's forces of good and evil, soaking the soil in blood, most famously during the Civil War. Though the outcome proved redemptive, the emancipation of the enslaved, the memory of that terrible price paid may be fading from public memory. What is unprecedented about our moment is that we now seem willing to destroy one another over matters so strikingly trivial, it's shocking. To understand this new disuniting of the Republic, we should consider the old language of character, virtue and vice, and the roles two groups play in shaping civic character, novelist and journalist. Toxic polarization may well be the social expression of a moral decay, a rot at the heart of the republic, a fundamental failure of character. This, I know, sounds rather conservative. Today, talk of character and virtue often strikes us as old-fashioned and inherently conservative. To illustrate how very different thinkers in American history have turned to the ethics of character to diagnose political ills and propose remedies, I'm going to briefly turn to Thomas Jefferson before turning to someone quite different, Ida B. Wells, the African-American anti-lynching crusader. Both responded to crises in public life through direct, intimate addresses to their fellow citizens and future ones by offering guidance on cultivating the civic character necessary to sustain a democratic republic. They understood that the survival of our constitutional order depended on the moral constitution of citizens. That term we use interchangeably for a reason. There's a parallelism that runs through our use of it. Jefferson shared the speculative psychology of his generation. He understood human beings as creatures shaped by both nature and society, by their innate capacities and their political environments. This view, which he inherited from the Scottish Enlightenment, led him to draw several conclusions. First, republican and democratic institutions depend for their survival and their stability on corresponding democratic and republican virtues and norms. Second, those institutions can endure only if citizens actually possess the habits and dispositions that sustain them. Third, character formation therefore becomes a central problem of citizenship rather than a private moral concern. Fourth, and finally, each generation bears the responsibility of transmitting to the next the moral virtues and civic habits deemed necessary to preserve republican and democratic life. Someone who possesses the virtues of character traits of temperance, patience, and restraint is far more likely to show forbearance, self-restraint in the exercise of legal power. Demanding or calling on one to show forbearance means little if there isn't a disposition there to do so. These four presumptions run through the writings of Jefferson, the founders generally, and especially Franklin, all of whom presented themselves as exemplars of the virtues and habits necessary for personal success and public responsibility. They recognized that their generation was bequeathing to the next a new and fragile form of government, the survival of which depended on subsequent generations of citizens for, acquiring what they might call the firmest props of government. Jefferson, for example, insisted in his letters to his nephew and grandson that every generation is cast into the world in need of civic guidance, specifically lessons in cultivating civic virtues, and perhaps more importantly, avoiding civic vices that render one worthless or dangerous to society and instead to society. So on a conservative reading of this, we might think of character as fundamentally determining one's circumstance. Moral failure then would explain things like poverty or disadvantage. But on a more radical reading, you might think of an unjust world demands the cultivation of virtues that enable reform and repair. Virtues that make it possible to join or even lead something like a revolution. In his 1789 farewell address, Jefferson says virtue is among the firmest props of government, that it is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government, and that any sincere friend of free government cannot afford to look with indifference upon how lacking the right character can shake the foundation and the fabric of a nation. But the question then is, how do we improve our moral and civic character? First, Jefferson argues that we must begin by cultivating moral sentiment and enlarging the moral imagination. For Jefferson, these virtues such as benevolence, restraint, and sincerity are especially important for citizenship. And interestingly, he suggested that literature educates moral sentiment more than history or philosophy, because it carries the reader beyond the limits of her own world, placing her behind the eyes of another and inviting her to inhabit lives at once familiar and foreign. In doing so, it allows the citizen to observe love, pain, and joy, perhaps even hatred, across worlds and partisan lines, far and near, affording her an opportunity to see how others have fared and are faring in worlds both beautiful and terrifying. To see the importance of this point about cultivating moral sense, consider how rural Americans are portrayed in fiction and film, or even in hallways in the academy. The casual contempt and last acceptable bigotries of modern academic and artistic life is to shame and disregard these people. And then we are surprised, shocked, perhaps offended that they would use their vote to destroy it all. Most scholars approach the threat to democracy as inhering in one of the nation's two political parties. Even if that is true, and I suspect it is not, acting from that proposition alone forecloses the very virtues necessary to find common ground. How we imagine those who we disagree with has a profound effect on how we understand and respond to them, whether we reduce or exacerbate the problem of polarization. If we write about polarization from within one of the encampments, we are not actually doing anything to reduce it. We are merely dressing up partisan bigotry in academic garbs. The question is, how do we step outside of it and actually strike something remotely resembling the ideal of social science or analytical philosophy, a truly sort of objective standpoint in which we don't start from the proposition that we face an existential threat from the other side. Even if we do, we might have strategic reasons not to strike that epistemic pose. None of what I've said is to avoid confronting injustice. Rather, in the long 19th century, political theorists advocated both social sympathy and fearless speech. Both novelists and journalists were expected to dedicate their pens to indirectly and directly reforming the public. In Ida B. Wells's day, Americans treated sincerity and truthfulness as virtues essential to the common good. Truthfulness was seen as an essential condition for the welfare of society. Many considered it an associative duty, an obligation citizens owe one another within a shared community, limited to relations with members of the same tribe or state. Social trust, in this view, underrides communal life and political stability. This view meant journalists played a significant role in preserving a democratic order. Earnest reporting, that old-fashioned word, exposes injustice and corruption, and in doing so advances reform. When a journalist condemns conduct destructive to society, she sketches a vision of the more just conditions toward that society should strive. By exposing the destructive consequences of the Southern press that refused to report honestly on lynching and, in many cases, outright aided the practice, Wells did more than ask her readers to recoil from lynching, but rather to summon the civic resolve to end it. Honest, fearless reporting, she thought, cultivated civic virtues such as sympathy and justice, the ethical springs of a free and equal society. Yet nurturing these dispositions required journalists willing to write truthfully and forcefully about injustice, even in the face of death, as she did. Journalists therefore had to cultivate what Wells called an honest and fearless temper. 19th century thinkers widely treated earnestness as a moral virtue, the inclination to speak sincerely and with moral seriousness, This character trait prevented one from falling into blind partisanship or outright cynicism. The philosopher Henry Sedgwick observed that courage matters because danger often appears suddenly and must be met without deliberation. Victorians, for all their fussiness, distinguish physical from moral courage. Physical courage meant risking life for one's country. Moral courage meant risking social isolation for speaking truth. It did not require rashness. Often it meant calm under pressure. Wells recognized, however, that social criticism by black writers demanded both forms. Black journalists who wrote candidly about lynching invited rope and rifle. Moral courage was necessary to speak what was true and honorable plainly yet kindly, as Wells wrote, to those who had long departed from truth, honor, and virtue. Wells treated fearless speech as the essence of true journalism. The journalist must possess candor and courage in the face of professional and physical danger. For her, frankness and fearlessness were radical virtues, dispositions directed both toward oneself and toward the public. Journalism rested on an ethical pact with the citizenry. The journalist must cultivate sincerity, earnestness, and courage because reporting on injustice invites persecution. The journalist's task was not merely to satisfy her conscience. It was, in many ways, to reduce cruelty in the world. I just want to end by pointing out that in making these remarks, I'm offering a sober suggestion, one that encourages humility. Perhaps artists and journalists, novelists, and maybe journalists today are replaced by television anchors or influencers. I hadn't thought about that, but that's where we are. Perhaps they, for good or ill, are going to be the shapers of the public mood. And if that's true, the fate of polarization will be ultimately narrated by the scriptwriter, the novelist, and the journalist, and yet increasingly, they're just really not part of the conversation. And that, I think, is quite interesting because in reality, a film, a novel, perhaps even an influencer is likely to have far more impact than any of us. And I think we should actually find that both humbling and sobering. Because are we really actually addressing this in any meaningful way that reaches those who needs to hear what is being said? Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you to David and Ron and the organizers for putting together this fascinating conversation. I'm going to take up a theme that has come up a few times in the discussions this morning, which is that we may be able to combat partisan animosity without necessarily becoming friends first. And I'm going to do that by talking not about the causes of partisan polarization. I think we can probably agree that we got where we are now because of processes that were long in the making, that were institutionally driven, that had to do with our media landscape and the business of media as well as with politics. I think we can agree both that those processes are self-reinforcing. So I don't want to talk about the causes of polarization. Instead, what I want to talk about is what has become a kind of popular solution to polarization. And it's one that makes sense, going back to David's point about the conventional wisdom. So in this solution to partisan polarization, we need to talk to each other. We need to talk one-on-one, face-to-face. We need to share personal stories, listen, empathize, aim to identify common ground rather than try to score ideological points. And there are now a number of organizations that do just this, that bring ordinary Americans together in facilitated conversations in which they share personal stories, try to empathize with each other, try to recognize ways in which they're more similar than different, with the organizers promising that these kinds of conversations and the bonds, the affinities that are formed in these conversations have the capacity to scale rifts that are long in the making and wide in scope. And I want to talk not so much about whether these initiatives work or do not work, because I think, as David said, some of them work and some of them don't, and we need to figure out which ones do and which ones don't. But I think as part of that, we need to think about the set of beliefs that underpin these dialogue initiatives, the set of beliefs about how social change happens, where solidarity comes from. And I'm going to argue that this kind of civic imaginary, this kind of political imaginary, these beliefs about how change is likely to happen, may actually impede our ability to attack partisan animosity, to deal with the toxic polarization that we've been talking about. And so this schema, sometimes I call it a kind of an imaginary of how social change happens, how solidarity across difference is built. In this schema, solidarity comes from the bottom up rather than the top down. It comes from ordinary people talking to one another. It comes from people exchanging their personal experiences rather than engaging in ideological grandstanding, sharing stories. It comes from the kind of empathy and something like friendship that can form in those settings where people are talking to each other one-on-one and sharing personal experiences. And then it comes from this process by which these bonds of solidarity, this experience of something like friendship, ripples outward to affect people who are not involved in the original conversations. Now, this schema of civic repair in which personal storytelling leads to empathy, leads to affinity, leads to broader solidarity, underpins a number of civic efforts, a number of ways in which people over the last, say, 30 years have tried to solve social problems. So, for example, before Americans' political polarization was the problem, Americans' disengagement from politics was seen as the problem. And there were a number of initiatives involving deliberation which brought ordinary Americans together to talk about issues, whether urban sprawl or healthcare, in small facilitated groups, with the idea that people sharing personal stories, identifying common ground, would lead to a kind of trust in each other that would then spiral outward to combat broader experiences of distrust in American government. This same schema underpins interracial dialogue groups. It underpins immersive travel to raise awareness of social problems. I've found this same kind of schema or theory of social change underpinning efforts to build human rights support. And I want to ask why this has become our kind of go-to solution for civic reform. And I can think of a couple of reasons. One is because it feels right. We've all had the experience, I'm sure, of talking to someone very different from us and gradually realizing that there were areas of similarity we hadn't identified before, that we kind of like each other in surprising ways. Anthony Giddens, who is a social theorist, wrote that this relationship of intimacy through mutual self-revelation, right? This relationship in which we expose more and more of ourself to the other with the idea that the other will listen appreciatively and sympathetically. that this has become a kind of ideal relationship for late moderns. And in fact, this is the way we think about what equality is. Not only a route to equality, but what equality looks like. I would add that in addition to these factors, in the last 30 years, there's been the growth of an industry of facilitators, people who are trained and skilled in facilitating difficult dialogue. And over the last 30 years, these kinds of professionals moved from the workplace, so originally facilitation was mainly in the workplace, to broader areas of civic life. Right? So we have people who are trained to conduct these difficult discussions, trained to rely on a set of practices that involves mutual sharing, empathy, recognizing areas of commonality, and arriving at, ideally, something like friendship. Now, as I said, I don't think the problem is particularly these initiatives. What I want to suggest is that to decide what actually works and what doesn't, I think we want to try to unsettle this underpinning imaginary about how social change works. We may want to ask some questions about whether this schema actually works and when it works. And I think the research suggests, and many of you know this research better than me, the research suggests that hearing someone's personal story may lead you to empathize with them. That experience of empathy may lead you to think about the group of which they're a member in a new way, in a more favorable way. And that may in turn lead people in your social circle to think about the larger group. So that can happen, but it often does not, okay? And just to flag a couple of pieces of research, personal stories often have no impact on people's opinions. We ignore them. Sometimes personal stories lead us to kind of hunker down and believe our prior views even more strongly. Asking people to take the perspective of a person who fits a stereotype can harden those stereotypes rather than undermine them. Natural empaths, people who are really good at empathy, are more likely to hold polarized political views than those who are not. Participants in dialogue projects, people who were invited to step out of their daily life and meet people from the other side and have a conversation with them, are self-selected, right? And are, among other things, are probably unusually open to talking with someone from the other side. And finally, the research suggests that the effects of these interventions often decay rapidly. And we know really nothing about whether there's any kind of impact on people outside the circle. So again, this isn't always the case, but I want to suggest that we rethink this moral imaginary or civic imaginary and think in particular about the possibility that it may foreclose other kinds of talk other than personal sharing. It may crowd them out in a way that leads us not to consider them as possibly effective in combating partisan animosity. It may lead us to ignore other settings of talk, right? And in particular, I'm going to argue ones that are more integrated into people's daily lives. And it may lead us to ignore or obscure, crowd out other kinds of relationships, other than something like friendship, that are actually capable of building solidarity across difference. So let me just throw out a few ideas here. What we may miss, what are some possibilities that kind of exist outside this common schema of civic repair? And one is other kinds of talk other than personal sharing. The really good facilitators I've seen and canvassers I've seen use personal storytelling, but they also use other modes of talk, bargaining, joking, critical introspection, debate. Gordon Allport, who was the father of intergroup contact theory, which is sort of the basis of dialogue initiatives, talked about team coordinating and problem solving talk, as well as mutual sharing. I want to talk to David more about his deep canvassing because I'm convinced that more is going on in those effective deep canvassing episodes than I share your story and you share yours. Right? I think there's a kind of mutual co-constitution of stories that may be important. Second, and I want to talk for a couple minutes about this, we may miss other settings for talk, especially ones that are integrated into people's daily lives. Right? And I think this is important because there's a tendency to think about solutions as being either at the level of the individual, right, bottom up. We need to convince people one by one that they don't have anything to fear from Republicans or Democrats. Or we think about top-down solutions, reforming our political system. Right now, that doesn't look much in the cards. And I want to suggest that there is another level at which change can be made and has been made, which is change in the institutions in which we live, work, worship, play, the institutions in which we're embedded in a daily way and that can really have impact in a more lasting way. And so because I just have a couple minutes, I'm going to talk about one place in which I think you can reach people that we haven't much talked about, which is in front of their TVs. Anash talked about the changes in the media landscape and talked mainly about news. Desmond brought up Hollywood scriptwriters. And I want to make the argument that fictional TV is a kind of underutilized resource in combating toxic polarization. So imagine a TV show. I'm just going to throw this out. I thought of it last night. Imagine a TV show in which a TV comedy you really like, in which a character makes friends with a cross-partisan couple. One's Democratic, one's Republican, and they're lovable and wacky family. Right? Or imagine a game show in which you have attractive teams of Republicans and Democrats competing against each other in silly games involving giant bobbleheads or great greased balancing beams or cream pies. Okay, now I'm not sure this is my ticket to Hollywood, but I want to suggest two reasons why I think this kind of thing actually might be effective. One is that we know fictional TV is really persuasive. Right? So if you see a character on your favorite TV show who makes friends with a member of a stigmatized group or who decides to begin composting, it is likely to have an effect on you. And so this is an area of persuasion in which there have been really sort of powerful documented effects. Just to name one, in 1988, a Harvard public health professor convinced a lot of popular TV shows to integrate a storyline about a designated driver, someone who would drive friends and not drink himself. The term was unknown to Americans at that point. After it was used in TV shows, it became widely used, widely practiced. Traffic fatalities dropped by 25% within 3 years. And the reason scholars say is partly because entertainment is entertaining. We don't expect scriptwriters to be trying to persuade us. And one of the things that we know about stories is that stories are often ineffective when you think they're intended to persuade you. So fictional TV is powerful because you're not expecting it to be persuasive. And it's powerful because of the parasocial relationships we form with characters on our favorite TV shows. If they behave in certain ways, if they express certain beliefs, we're more likely to subscribe to them. So the first reason I would argue for us to think about TV as being one among the places in people's daily lives where we can actually combat this toxic polarization. So one reason is because TV persuasion is effective. But the other reason is because TV is an industry that might be willing to change. And by that, I mean, there's now an industry, really, of advocacy groups who work with Hollywood producers to try to get their message integrated into TV shows, whether it's the urgency of climate change, inequality, mental health, and sometimes they're successful. They're usually successful not because they can draw on the goodwill of TV producers, but because they can convince them that this new storyline actually could draw viewers. Right? TV scriptwriters, going back to Desmond's point, TV scriptwriters are always looking for a new story. They want a ripped from the headline plot line. Right? And so if you can supply that ripped from the headline, plot line, then TV producers may see it as in their interest to run your pro-social message. In this case, your pro-partisan solidarity message. So this is I'm just talking off the top of my head, but the point, I think, is that we need to think about ways in which we can reach people where we are, right? I'd love to have David Bruckman's deep canvassing taught to Uber drivers and hairdressers, right? People who talk to us in our daily lives, rather than requiring people to leave their lives, meet with a group of people with whom they share antagonism with likely few effects on down the road. And then finally, I want to suggest that this imaginary of mutual sharing leading to affinity that then spirals outward to political solidarity may miss other kinds of relationships on which we might build solidarity, other than friendship or something like friendship. Americans are used to cooperating as neighbors, allies, members of a jury, collaborators, as people who are bound by narrow and temporally based interests. Right? So the possibility, and it goes back to something Jennifer raised earlier today, the possibility is that we can mobilize people around bread and butter issues, right? Issues they care about, like elder care, health care, a living wage, with the idea that the solidarity may follow from the cooperation rather than preceding it. And I would argue more generally that Americans' vernacular of solidarity is richer than we typically think, especially when we think of the options as animosity or friendship. And so I'll just conclude by suggesting that building bonds across partisan lines may require both more than intimacy, in the sense that it requires more than a fleeting experience of connection with someone you'll probably never talk to again, and less than intimacy, in the sense that we may not need to be friends to cooperate. Thank you.
So I have a question. I'm a family law attorney I'm interested in doing workplace mediations. And do you have any suggestions then on, if some of those workplace conflicts are politically driven, how to approach those conversations when you can get two people into a room to mediate?
I don't know. I think probably the virtue of that setting is that people work together, right? So they have to learn to live together. So in some ways, if we want to mediate partisan conflicts, the workplace might be the ideal place in which to do it. Right? It's a perfect example of a place where people need to live with each other without necessarily becoming friends. Right? And so in some ways, I think it's an opportunity to model kinds of relationships in which our differing political views are not destructive, are not debilitating of the possibility for cooperation.
Sorry, just one last thing, that if you do that, is it just through having the people talk to each other? Do you think there's a specific framework that would be helpful for them to then understand each other, or just having those deeper conversations and fostering the empathy?
Well, I think there's a lot we need to know. We need to know what kinds of conversations work. I think there's this kind of assumption that intimacy is the best route to agreement or to diffusing conflict. And so I would argue, and this goes back to David's point, that we need to know a lot more about what actually works. And sort of bracket or suspend or question this idea that intimacy is the kind of be-all and end-all.
Hi there. So on that theme, a couple of years ago, I saw a presentation on something called the Digitalist Papers, which talked about ways about how we reimagine democracy in the digital age. And there was an interesting presentation of technology that's actually being developed out of Taiwan for trying to develop a more inclusive online kind of chat program. I wonder if you've had a chance to take a look at it. It looked particularly interesting.
No, have you? Okay.
Well, I don't know that but I'm not an expert in that area. But I suspect the idea of it, tell me if I'm wrong, is that some of the measures of it show that maybe chatting with a bot actually score higher on empathy levels, the AI module, and can actually did better at allowing one to arrive at a consensus than maybe chatting with an actual partisan.
I think that was part of it. I'm not all that familiar with the, I didn't actually read the paper. I just was listened to the presentations and thought it was an interesting thing to explore.
I mean, one of the interesting things so Van Loon and Chris Bale have this project where people who participate in a social media chat get a badge if they're open-minded in their interactions with people. And they find that when they get that badge, it makes them more intellectually humble. They're more likely to see their facts as questionable. And I think what's important about that is that social media is in people's lives already. Right? And so it's not requiring people to step out of their lives. And it's possible that while social media companies are not going to agree to an overhaul of their business model, they may be willing to undertake these sort of smaller scale reforms that can have an impact.
Two questions. One on the idea of bringing groups of people together to discuss these issues or whatever other issues are current in a non-confrontational, non-argumentative meeting. What percentage of our population do you think would be interested in attending those groups? And if it's very minor percentage, is it nevertheless useful? And the second question involves the fictional TV shows. Your talking about it really inspired me to think that is a method. And I thought way back in the day, All in the Family was a show that brought those things together, and over time, Archie Bunker evolved into a different person than he was at the beginning. But those kinds of dialogue in that kind of show would be canceled out. It would be considered inappropriate to have in a modern TV show. So what are the prospects of that? those two questions.
Yeah, great questions. You know, when Ash was talking, I was thinking that All in the Family had 50 million viewers per episode, right? So the network's capture of the American audience was huge. And I'm actually working on a project right now on the representation of the women's movement in popular television and especially women's magazines, and finding that those representations really had an impact on Americans' views of the roles of women in the home and in the workplace. So yes, I agree that popular media, we often, in the study of social movements, we often talk about the news and we don't talk about popular media, but it can be really impactful. I would argue, to your first point, absolutely. The problem is several people go out, someone goes out, meets someone, has this meaningful interaction, nothing happens afterwards. Does that matter? It could. And so, you know, we should attack on all fronts, but I would argue that the advantage of mass media and the advantage of the kind of parasocial relationships that people can forge with figures on TV is that it reaches a lot more people. Right? We are capable of being affected by people with whom we do not have direct relationships. I think that's the insight.
I really appreciate both of your talks. So I have a thought and a question. Yesterday, Bernard Lafayette, who is a real lion of the civil rights movement, passed away. And I had an opportunity to work very closely with him and some other organizers of that era. And one of the things that they often emphasized is that we sort of have this idea of shared interests as the thing that brings us together, when in fact, sometimes you can have mutually exclusive interest that you realize you cannot reach unless you cooperate. And in fact, that was a much more common way of bringing people together. So thank you for questioning. Even though I've gone to many a dialogue and enjoy them, thank you for questioning that. The other thing they talk a lot about is this idea of contempt being a moral harm to self and character development. And I'm really curious if you see a role that higher ed can or should play in that sort of character formation.
I think it's difficult in the following way. On the one hand, it's clearly the case that certain virtues or dispositions shape our behavior and conduct towards each other. But also, you have to guard against the dangers of having these vices, and perhaps the even worse vice of paternalism. So if we have a higher education, I think about this a lot as a professor, and I hope all of you think about this. You know, our job is to teach our students how to think, but never what they ought to think about things of moral significance in which there is reasonable disagreement. So we also live in a constitutional order to the right to association and the right of privacy that really limits our ability to impart some of these virtues. This is one of the challenges of civic education. So I think higher education you might do the best you can by modeling the virtues, but not imparting what one ought to think about anything of moral significance, because then you replicate the problem of moral arrogance.
If I can add one thing, you know, in some ways, the contemporary inheritors of the work that people like Bernard Lafayette did are the people who do community organizing. And I've found community organizing really interesting because of the relationships that they strive to create among members. They're very clear that this is not about becoming friends. We organize people on the basis of mutual interests. right? And yet they create forms of solidarity that are incredibly effective and that cross usual lines of race, class, religion, sometimes partisanship. And so I think going back to Desmond's quote of Jefferson talking about expanding our moral imagination, I would argue in line with what you've suggested that we may want to expand our imagination around the kinds of relationships that can motivate joint action.
All right, I'll steal a question. So I think the last panel and this panel both are really, I think, putting their finger in part on this question of scale, right? I mean, we're a country of over 300 million people, and I think you're pointing, and when you think about the limits of stories, right? Part of it is, and I think we do see this in our research, that the effects are there, but they're not huge. And so if you do some back of the envelope math of what would it mean to solve toxic polarization through these one-on-one conversations, I mean, it's like boiling the ocean, basically. So I've always thought of that research that I've done more is about kind of a laboratory to think about understanding what kinds of approaches work and less making the case for this particular medium of interpersonal conversation. But I guess this raises the question, if there's like the skepticism a lot of us have around and I share around the idea of kind of boiling the ocean with a bunch of one-on-one conversations, what we then point ourselves towards. And so I think your talk did a great job of pointing towards one, which is the mass media. And I'm curious, I think later in the day with, I think in part Professor Schickler's keynotes and maybe some of the, on the Insights from Abroad panel, another theme we might think about, for example, is the structure of political institutions, right? So one story, for example, that's told is that in the US, we had a lot of polarization in the national level, in part because our national elections have gotten a lot more competitive. And so the parties have more incentive to vilify each other than they used to have in the 60s when Democrats had a stranglehold on the House and Senate. There was less competition. There was this, and that was because there was this coalition between Northern and Southern Democrats. And now we're kind of returning to an era of back to normal, like we had in the Gilded Age. This is just what our political system produces. In a country like ours, in the 60s was this kind of weird, aberrant time. And so that would militate towards, well, we've got to change the institutions. I'm curious your thoughts on that kind of way of thinking about things, and maybe are there other solutions? Like if we buy what you're saying, besides the mass media, do we turn to institutions, or are there other things we want to turn to if we buy your thesis?
Yeah, great question. So we often use the term scaling up, and it makes it seem deceptively simple, right? Scaling up is not easy, and I think what I would encourage us to think about are what are the places that we can have an impact, right? Dialogue initiatives in college are kind of interesting because these are young people who have plastic minds and who are talking with other young people about what they're hearing and learning and doing. So if we think about institutions that are, and of course none of this is mutually exclusive, right? One of the problems of this imaginary of friendship coming from the bottom up is that it risks suggesting that these kinds of strategies are better than or incompatible with top-down reform, and they're not at all. We should be working on all fronts. This middle level, right, the institutions within which we work, study, worship, play, are amenable to different processes of change, different levers of change. So just to give you an example, corporations began offering women maternity leaves in the 1970s, well before the government required them to do so. And the reason they did was because a number of women who were in this newly feminizing human resources profession had had their consciousness raised by the women's movement and basically communicated to CEOs that there was federal legislation that was going to come down the pike and they better get ahead of it and start offering women maternity leaves now. And so as a social movement scholar, I would argue that there's often a kind of leverage that is accessible to people who want to make change in non-formally political institutions as well as formally political institutions.
Sorry.
Sorry. We have to conclude the panel, but I invite you to keep continuing the conversations over lunch. Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Great.
Desmond and
So-
Francesca.
Just thank you guys for that wonderful panel. So quick logistical announcements. So